Tyler Perry stood in the first-class boarding line, dressed simply, a stark contrast to the wealth and status that surrounded him. A man a few spots behind watched him, his expression shifting between amusement and mild disdain. He couldn't hide his arrogance. What happened next would leave everyone on that plane speechless and forever change one man's perspective on status, success, and what it truly means to belong. The Los Angeles International Airport was as chaotic as ever. Conversations overlapping, suitcases rolling in every direction, and exhausted travelers rushing toward their gates. Amidst the crowd, Tyler stood calmly, his presence somehow different from those around him. He wore a simple gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of well-worn sneakers. Slung over his shoulder was a black leather backpack, aged from years of use. There was nothing flashy about him, and perhaps because of that, he went unnoticed. But anyone who took a closer look could sense something unshakable about him. He wasn't like the others in line, who checked their watches or impatiently tapped their feet. He stood with a kind of quiet assurance, as if he had nothing to prove. While others scrolled through their phones or looked around anxiously, Tyler simply took in the moment. Just behind him in line was Richard Langston. Richard was the complete opposite of Tyler. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit, shined leather shoes, and a Rolex that caught the light with every movement. His cologne was subtle but expensive. Just like everything else about him, he was used to commanding respect, used to being noticed. Every movement he made seemed rehearsed, as though he wanted the world to recognize his importance. His eyes flicked down the line, scanning the other first-class passengers when they landed on Tyler. He smirked. "First class, huh?" Richard said, loud enough for Tyler and a few others nearby to hear. His tone was casual, but the meaning behind it was anything but. "You never know who you'll run into these days." Tyler turned his head slightly, meeting Richard's gaze with calm eyes. There was no irritation, no defensiveness, just a quiet confidence. "The world is full of surprises," Tyler replied simply. Richard frowned for a brief moment. He had expected a different reaction. Maybe an awkward laugh, maybe embarrassment. Instead, Tyler's response was measured, steady. Richard wasn't done. "Nothing personal," he added with a smooth chuckle. "You just don't seem like the type who flies first class." Tyler tilted his head slightly, considering the words before shrugging. "Maybe not," he said, "but we all end up in the same place when the plane lands." Before Richard could respond, the boarding announcement came over the speakers. The first-class line moved forward. Passengers retrieved their boarding passes and disappeared down the jet bridge. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and stepped onto the plane with the confidence of a man accustomed to luxury. He walked through the first-class cabin, scanning the plush leather seats until he reached his row. Then he stopped mid-step. There, settling into the seat right next to his, was Tyler Perry. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Tyler looked up, catching the expression on Richard's face, and smiled. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said smoothly. Richard sank into his seat, feeling an unexpected discomfort. This was going to be a long flight. And somehow, deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Tyler Perry adjusted his backpack under the seat in front of him, his movements calm and measured, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The hum of conversation around them mixed with the mechanical sounds of flight attendants preparing for departure. Beside him, Richard Langston took a deep breath, as if trying to make sense of the situation. Richard had spent his life in spaces like this, luxurious, exclusive, filled with people who belonged. He was used to recognizing his own, knowing who fit and who didn't. And, in his mind, Tyler didn't fit. The first-class cabin was nearly full now, a handful of passengers still finding their seats. Richard shifted slightly, glancing at the expansive legroom, the polished mahogany accents, the glass of chilled champagne that had been placed on his tray. He glanced at Tyler, expecting him to order the same. Instead, when the flight attendant turned to him, Tyler gave a small nod. "Just water, please." Richard let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Water? You're flying first class and drinking water?" Tyler took the bottle from the flight attendant without hesitation. "Sometimes simplicity is enough." Richard smirked. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. But not everyone's meant to enjoy the best life has to offer. The words hung in the air for a moment, as if testing the space between them. A few passengers nearby glanced up, sensing the underlying tension. Tyler, still calm, took a slow sip of his water before finally responding. Maybe the best looks different for everyone. Richard exhaled sharply. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way Tyler spoke, the confidence, the certainty, irritated him. He was used to dominance, to being the one in control of conversations like this. Well, Richard continued, swirling the champagne in his glass, life is a lot like flying first class. You work hard, you earn your spot, and then you enjoy it. But some people... He let his eyes travel down Tyler's casual hoodie, well-worn jeans, and aged backpack before smirking again. Some people are just here because they got lucky. Tyler set his bottle of water down, finally turning to face Richard fully. His gaze was steady, calm, but unshakable. Whether you fly first class or coach, drink champagne or water, he said, his voice even, certain, we all land in the same place. Richard's smirk faltered for just a second. The air in the cabin seemed different now, heavier, charged. A few passengers nearby exchanged quiet glances. The flight attendant, who had been pretending not to listen, now lingered near the aisle. Richard let out a dry chuckle, trying to regain his footing. That's a nice sentiment, he said, lifting his champagne glass. Sounds like something you'd hear in a Hallmark movie. But the real world doesn't work like that. Some of us, he took a slow sip, enjoying the weight of his own words, are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands what it means to be here. Tyler leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together in his lap. I think the value of being here, he said, gesturing around the first-class cabin, isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat others. The words landed with undeniable weight. Richard felt something shift in the air. He glanced around and realized others were listening now. Not just eavesdropping, but genuinely paying attention. For the first time, Richard felt off balance in his own domain. He wasn't sure why, but something about Tyler's response unnerved him. It wasn't defiant, wasn't arrogant. It was just true. Richard forced another laugh, shaking his head. That's a good one. First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should write a book. His sarcasm was evident, but this time it felt forced. Tyler smiled, a short, knowing smile, before turning back to face forward, ending the conversation without saying another word. That silence, somehow, spoke louder than anything. By the time the plane had reached cruising altitude, the tension between them had settled, but Richard couldn't shake it. The flight attendants moved smoothly through the aisles, serving plated meals with fine silverware. He barely touched his filet mignon, pushing it around on his plate. Tyler, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at peace. He ate his meal in comfortable silence, occasionally flipping through the pages of a book. Richard shifted in his seat. He had spent his entire life in rooms like this, commanding respect, making sure he was seen. But something about this moment, this interaction, made him feel like a child again, like he was the one being watched. The problem was Tyler Perry had nothing to prove, and Richard did. Clearing his throat, he turned toward Tyler again. So, he started, his tone more direct this time. What do you do for a living? Tyler glanced up briefly. I work in film. Richard raised an eyebrow. Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time projects? Tyler smiled, shaking his head slightly. Something like that? Richard chuckled, shaking his own head. I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place, but sometimes certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance. Tyler didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Richard for a long moment before finally turning back to his book. That silence again. That silence that was getting under Richard's skin. You know, Richard continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Some places will never really belong to certain people, no matter how much they try to blend in. Tyler finally looked at him again, and this time, his expression changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was patience. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of pity. For the first time in his life, Richard felt exposed. Not because he had been called out, not because of anything Tyler had said, but because deep down, he knew Tyler was right. The quiet hum of the plane seemed louder now, filling the long pause between them. Passengers around them had stopped pretending not to listen. Some watched with veiled curiosity, others exchanged knowing glances. Richard tried to mask his discomfort, but he could feel it. He had entered this conversation thinking he was in control, but now he felt like he had just lost something, and he didn't even know what. He turned away, staring out the window as the clouds stretched endlessly below them. For the first time in years, Richard Langston had nothing to say, and that silence was deafening. The flight continued, but the weight of their interaction lingered. Richard sipped his champagne, but it didn't taste the same anymore. Tyler read his book, unbothered, unaffected. Richard was used to winning. Conversations, negotiations, life itself. But for the first time he had the sinking realization that this wasn't just a conversation. It was a lesson. And whether he liked it or not, something inside him had already started to change. Richard Langston stared out the window, watching the clouds stretch across the vast sky. Below them, the world moved as it always had, oblivious to the tension that hung between him and Tyler Perry. The first-class cabin was silent now, save for the occasional clink of glasses and the hushed voices of passengers conversing in whispers. But for Richard, the silence was deafening. He had spent his life in control, in spaces where he belonged, exclusive clubs, executive boardrooms, and first-class cabins filled with people who looked, spoke, and thought like him. Yet, sitting beside Tyler, he felt like an outsider in his own domain. And the worst part, Tyler had done nothing to put him in that position. No arrogance, no attempts to prove himself, no need to make a statement. He had simply been himself, and that, more than anything, had unsettled Richard in a way he wasn't ready to admit. He took another sip of his champagne, but the taste had changed. It wasn't as crisp, wasn't as satisfying. It was just liquid in a glass. He stole a glance at Tyler, who had returned to his book, seemingly unfazed. How? Richard wondered. How can someone be so calm, so secure, so unshaken? It gnawed at him. The thought wouldn't let go. Finally, he exhaled and set his champagne down. "You know," he started, forcing his voice into its usual measured confidence, "I still don't get it." Tyler didn't look up. "What's that?" Richard shifted, trying to regain his composure. "You. The way you carry yourself." He gestured vaguely. "You just don't seem to care what anyone thinks." Tyler finally closed his book and turned to face him. "Why would I?" Richard blinked. "Because that's just how the world works." He chuckled, though it felt forced. "Status matters. Perception matters. You know that, don't you?" Tyler nodded slowly. "I know that some people believe it does." Richard leaned forward slightly. "But it does." Tyler studied him for a moment before speaking. "Tell me something, Richard. Do you actually enjoy this?" Richard frowned. "Enjoy what?" "The constant need to prove yourself. The idea that you always have to be the smartest, the wealthiest, the most successful person in the room." Richard hesitated. "That's just life." Tyler tilted his head. "Is it?" A long pause. Richard clenched his jaw, suddenly feeling uncomfortable in his own skin. "Look, I worked hard to get here," he said, his voice firmer now. "Nothing was handed to me. And in my world, if you don't show what you have, people won't take you seriously. You'll be overlooked, forgotten." Tyler nodded. "I believe you." Richard scoffed, expecting a different response. "You do?" "Sure," Tyler said. "But that doesn't mean you have to live like that forever." Richard narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Tyler leaned back in his seat. "It means that at some point you have to ask yourself, who are you without all this? Without the tailored suits, the first-class tickets, the expensive watch? If you lost it all tomorrow, who would you be?" Richard felt his pulse quicken. He wanted to laugh it off, dismiss it as just another one of those empty motivational lines. But he couldn't. Because deep down, the question struck something raw. Who was he, really? His name carried weight. His money earned him access. His status commanded respect. But without all of it, without the labels, the titles, the luxury, what was left? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Tyler waited, watching him carefully. And for the first time in decades, Richard had no answer. The flight continued in near silence. For the first time, Richard didn't feel the urge to fill the quiet with meaningless conversation. He didn't know what to say. Tyler, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. He flipped through his book, took occasional sips of water, and stared out the window as if he had all the time in the world. It was Richard who was restless now, tapping his fingers against the armrest, shifting in his seat, checking his watch even though he knew exactly how much time remained. He felt like a child, like he had just been told something he wasn't ready to understand, and yet he couldn't stop thinking about it. Later, as the flight attendant passed through the cabin, Richard caught her attention. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quieter now. "Could I just have water?" The flight attendant blinked, momentarily surprised, but nodded and retrieved a bottle for him. As she handed it over, Richard hesitated before accepting it. His champagne glass sat untouched on the tray beside him. The bubbles now faded. He glanced at Tyler, who was already watching him, a small, knowing smile playing at his lips. Richard let out a breath, shaking his head. "Don't read too much into it." Tyler just chuckled, taking another sip of his own water. "No judgment here," he said. Richard sighed and unscrewed the cap, taking a small sip. It was just water, and yet, somehow, it tasted different this time. As the flight neared its destination, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the final descent into New York. Richard watched as the city lights came into view, stretching endlessly beneath them. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a revelation. It wasn't a dramatic change. But it was something. A seed. A thought. A question he wasn't quite ready to answer. And yet, the fact that he was even asking meant that something inside him had already started to change. As the plane touched down, he turned to Tyler one last time. "I don't know if I'll ever see you again," Richard admitted. Tyler smiled. "That's the funny thing about life. You never know who you'll run into again." Richard chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I still don't get you," he said. Tyler shrugged. "You don't have to." The seatbelt light blinked off and passengers began gathering their things, stretching, preparing for the rush to deplane. Richard hesitated before speaking again. "I need to apologize," he said finally. "Not because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." Tyler studied him for a moment before nodding. "I appreciate that." Richard sighed. "I don't know if I'll change, but I think you've given me something to think about." Tyler gave a small nod. "That's a start." The passengers began filing out of the cabin. As Richard grabbed his carry-on, he glanced at Tyler one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said. Tyler smiled. "You too." And just like that, they parted ways. Richard stepped into the airport terminal, the weight of the encounter still lingering. The world outside continued on, oblivious. People rushed past him, business travelers, families, tourists. Richard Langston had everything he'd ever wanted: wealth, status, success. And yet, for the first time in his life, he wasn't so sure if it was enough. As he walked through the terminal, his Rolex still on his wrist, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor, he reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the bottle of water he had taken from the flight. He held it for a second. And then, without thinking, he took another sip. It was just water, but it tasted different now.